Okay, so this next video is about how did I come up with this method for making the fluffy rugs, and how is it different than latch hooking or just other kinds of weaving. You may have seen rugs similar to this, the end result being similar, but this technique is different, so I'm going to explain how that evolved. So about 10 years ago, I was working for a nonprofit organization, and there were a whole bunch of t-shirts left after a big event. And actually what happened was the organization changed its logo. So actually this is one of the t-shirts, but I sewed this part over the old logo. But you know, they wanted to get rid of all these t-shirts. There was, I'm guessing, 100 t-shirts. Like, it was many boxes of t-shirts. And they said, Carla, do you want them for a craft project? And I said, sure. So I brought the t-shirts home, and so for 10 years I've been storing them and kind of moving them from one part of my house to the other, trying to make space. And then over the past year, I've been working really hard to either use up my art supplies, give them away, do something so that there's not so much. And I was looking at this giant amount of white t-shirts, and I was like, oh, I've really got to use these up. There's got to be something I can do to move these along in their life cycle. And the challenge was I kept hesitating because if you ever worked with fabric and you know that if something is white, then you're like, oh, that I could dye that, I could tie-dye that, I could dye that any color. And so I hesitate to use up white. I hold on until I'm in the middle of a project and I really need a certain color, and then I would dye it and blah, blah, blah. But that just never was happening. And plus, to be honest, there were so many shirts that it was just like, oh, I was never going to dye all those shirts. I would become a dyeing organization instead of a weaving or any other kind of organization. And so finally I said, you know what? I'm just going to start cutting up the t-shirts into t-shirt yarn. And I saw this great video about how to do that, and I was like, oh, this is much better than the method I had been using before this. So I just started doing that. And I started making balls of yarn like this. And then I was like, okay, well, this is fantastic. And then I would take those balls of yarn and I started weaving them in like a sort of a traditional weaving method. This is just a normal straight up weaving. I did it on this loom just like this. And I really loved making this, and I experimented, and oh yeah, I'm gonna try putting a color in there. So I experimented and I put this nice heart in the middle of my rug, and I was really pleased with that. But to be honest, like when I posted that on social media, I got like 0 response. People were like, oh, that's nice, but they weren't, it looked exactly like something you could buy at the store for like less than $10. And so there wasn't any reaction. And then the other challenge was that when I would cut the t-shirt, I would use all the fabric from here down, but I would have left over these, what I would call the yoke of the shirt, this top part, and then the sleeves. And after I had cut up like 50 of these, I was feeling pretty bad because I had this stack of upper shirt parts, and I was like, okay, I can't just throw all that out. I feel terrible about that. Well, the video I watched before didn't talk about cutting this up, but I'll give it a try. And then I started cutting it into these strips. And I showed this in the other video, like this length of strip comes from like the yoke. And then you'll get something more like this long from the sleeves. So I was like, well, these are, nice, but I'm not quite sure what to do with them. And they weren't quite long enough to be, they weren't quite long enough to be a warp thread. Like, oh, okay. So then I remembered from when I was a kid and I used to do latch hooking, and I thought, well, these could be nice for latch hooking. They're a little bit thick for my actual latch hooking tool, but maybe I can figure it out. But then I remembered that I had seen this really cool organization called Rugmate. And Rugmate is an organization in Europe that was started by a Finnish designer, and she was hiring Syrian refugee women to make rugs that were kind of like this in that they were very fluffy, and they had long pieces like this. And I remember thinking I really loved the Rugmate products. And they made their strips from offcuts from factories. So I was like, okay, well, I don't have offcuts from factories, but I have these. So then I was like, well, how are they, what are they tying those little strips to? And it looked like they were tying them to a very flexible black netting, kind of like what you might have on stockings, but I didn't have that. And then I thought, well, I could go get that stuff that you use when you were a kid and you were making latch hook rugs, but it was very stiff and kind of crunchy. And I was like, well, I don't want to make a rug with that crunchy stuff in it. Plus, I was in the middle of the pandemic and I didn't want to go to the store. I wanted to see, well, what could I do with only things I have in my house? That's what I'm going for here. So then I was like, well, wait a minute. When I make this, I am making a grid. This is a grid. If there was a little bit more space in between each of the threads, I would effectively have a grid that I could tie onto. Well, okay, how do I make sure there's space? Because this is obviously very tightly packed in. So I said, well, I'll just weave and then tie and weave and tie and weave and tie, and then the act of tying will create the space in the grid. And so that's how I came up with this method. And that's why I can use only recycled t-shirts to make this rug, and I don't need to go buy any materials. I don't have to buy a background grid, and I can make the grid exactly what I want in terms of colors, and I can make it match the t-shirts that are in the rug. So yeah, that is the innovation here. You could easily follow a lot of what I'm doing in this class and tie it onto a grid that you buy at a craft store, and you will get a similar result in the end, except for you have to go buy the backing, and you have whatever texture that backing is, you have that. So I think what the innovation here is that it's completely soft everywhere, even the back. And the back is actually quite beautiful. I'll show that in another video. Well, actually I can show it here. Some people actually think the back is more beautiful. It's very like just perfect. This is like chaos, and this is like but I mean, obviously I like the chaos side for just the aesthetic touch of it, but the back is entirely made of the same materials as the front. So that is the story of how I came up with this type of method and how it is different from any other kind of weaving or latch hooking. The other thing that's nice about this method is you don't need to have a latch hooking tool. You just need to have something to stretch the warp on. So I hope that clarifies how this method is different.